So, hey, Michael, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. So, Michael, could you go ahead and give us kind of a short bio and some of the things you're interested in?
Yeah, sure. I'm Michael Gibson. I'm co-founder and general partner at the 1517 Fund. We are a early stage fund that backs outsiders, so people who are doing something they shouldn't be doing in the eyes of some authority. And most of the time, that means our founders we back, they don't have degrees, or maybe they're pursuing some line of scientific research that the normal grant making academic institutions might not want to back that early. So early stage early stage tech companies. I myself am doing something I should not be doing. I'm not trained in in finance. My background goes back. I thought I'd become a professor of philosophy, and then I dropped out of that PhD program and was a journalist for a short time. Through a series of unlikely events, I wound up in Silicon Valley in 2015. Danielle Strackman, my co-founder, and we launched 1517.
Awesome. Well, it seems like you made a really good, it's quite a left turn to go from academia to VC, but I think I think you'll make a much bigger impact. Now, not that you couldn't make an impact in philosophy, but it seems like academic philosophy
Yeah.
is quite
I know.
quite
I
the game
like
now.
to. I think of a hypothetical, like what is it, counterfactual, where let's
Yeah,
say I did become a professor, and in the best case scenario, let's say I was a professor at Harvard. Over, I don't know, 20, 30-year career, I could advise undergraduates on their senior thesis. I might advise a few grad students on their dissertations. And if I add up that pile of scholarship and then I compare it to, the eccentrics that I work with and the younger people, I think, yeah, what they've done on this side is quite compelling. And maybe this scholarship would have it'd be collecting dust in some library somewhere. Maybe that's
definitely.
too harsh, though.
Tough to say. That's
But
awesome.
in a sense, I'm still somewhat professorial. It's interesting, is like because I work with a lot of university age entrepreneurs, and Danielle and I run tutorial style meetings. It feels a lot like we're running like the school for the X-Men, where
That's
we go
excellent.
out and we find the mutants out there. And I still have my hair. I'm not bald like Professor X, but he went to Oxford and I did too. So
There you go. I love that.
we got that in common.
That is a great framing. I love that. Um, so my first question, uh, on some level, the world is getting better. There's like the enlightenment now. We have less infant mortality. There's less extreme poverty. But on another level, I go out into, out of the metro pools and I drive out to the country and it's like bombed out buildings and bombed out people.
Right.
And and so I start to question that narrative, right? Like not everything is getting better. And what do you think about that? Where do you think we are right now? And are these some of these problems fixable?
It's a great point. I mean, it's something to keep in mind is that, there's a rate to progress, and the rate could be faster and slower. So, and then we're thinking, if you look over like a century's worth of time, then you start to see differences. So I don't want to deny that we've made progress since 1971 or so, but I think it's come much more slowly in sectors of the economy outside of communications and IT. So sure, yes, we're talking on Zoom. People just associate the word tech and technology with things they can do with their smartphone. But in an earlier era, technology just applied to anything, doing anything better, faster, cheaper, higher quality, you name it along those dimensions in any industry. So where have we not seen progress? Well, I mean, look at things like education. We've been spending more and more dollars per student per year, and we seem to be getting the same or less for it. So, yeah, and by that I mean, as you look at college, it's gone up something like 4 to 5x in real terms since late 70s. If I take an English seminar and discuss poetry at some bucolic liberal arts school in New England, I can't say that's much better in terms of quality than it used to be, let's say in 1975. That discussion is probably, it's rich, maybe even profound, but not like 4 times profound
Right.
than it
Exactly.
used to be, right? So we're not making progress there. And then if you look at you break down the demographics and geographical locations that you referred to, and it looks like, sure enough, yeah, some populations are not thriving, not making improvements as they were in the past. Median wages have stagnated, especially for men. People with only with high school degrees, meaning, maybe lower skilled labor. They've had a really hard time in the last 40 years. And we can debate the causes of that. It could be globalization opening up, the U.S. economy to Japanese cars, to now Chinese manufacturing, and so on. And then it could also be some automation. But yeah, there are regions of America that have suffered. The Rust Belt and Appalachia and places like that. They have not shared in the gains that other areas have. So that's concerning. There's a great website out there called, I think it's just WTF Happened in 1971. And it's a fantastic repository of data on all these kinds of different cuts on this question, because something happened in the early 70s where these numbers started changing. The median wages, the explosion in cost in healthcare, in higher education, the lower life expectancy for some populations as the opioid crisis swept through in the last 15, 20 years. So if anyone's listening, go to WTF Happened in 1971, and you'll get a lot of data. So it's interesting I think, to think about, what happened and what can we do differently. It is remarkable to me. My mom was raised by her grandmother, and if I think about her life, she'd be my great grandmother. Her life, she was born, I think, it was the 1880s in
Wow.
Texas. She lived in a copper mining town in Arizona. So she was born in an era where there was no radio, there were no cars, there were no airplanes, no jets, no television, no skyscrapers at first.
Oh man.
And then she died in 1980. And if you think about the amount that happened in that time, like, she lived to see someone on the moon.
Yeah.
So if you think of that as a lifetime, and then you look at the other data points about median wages and stuff, and you see that they would typically quadruple in that amount of time, so that the average worker with not many skills was making 4 times what they were
Right.
100 years earlier, with all these other quality of life improvements, and that is staggering. And that's a real shift in terms of progress. One of the economists' favorite statistics on progress, technological progress, is something called total factor productivity, meaning, based on these inputs, how much more of an output do you get? It's a tough, rough measure. But yeah, if you look from like 1900 to 1970, you're seeing this steady up and to the right increase. And then something happens, and it's still increasing, but nowhere near at the same clip, something like 20% compared to like the 4X. So something happened. I've been thinking a lot about how to change that. I mean, you could talk about certain institutions like higher education that could be reformed. We could talk law and policy about regulations and how we might free people up. There's a lot of different ways to address it, but it's a big problem.
Yeah, I think it's a huge problem. Like you said, it seems like essential goods have just been getting more and more expensive. Wages have been fairly stagnant. So I remember early on in the pandemic, I was playing this, I never really played video games that much, but I had some time because we're all locked inside, can't go out. And I'm playing this new video game. It's like Red Dead Redemption, and it's amazing. It's like this, I love westerns. It's like it's the most amazing experience you've ever seen. And then I got I opened some mail right after I'd finished it, and I had done a virtual primary care visit with a physician's assistant, and it cost it was $500, and I have pretty good insurance, and it was $500.
Wow.
And I was like, wait, this was a 30-minute visit with someone, it's not even a physician. And I was like, man, this is so wild, right? You're sitting here, this game, it's amazing. These our screens, they're so great, and we've had technological progress, but this office visit, it costs so much in real terms more than it used
Yeah.
to. It's gotten it seems like a very real problem. This is why people, I think, they feel worse off because essential goods cost more.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, that's a great contrast. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts out a report of inflation and tracking these types of goods,
yeah,
and there are some graphs out there where the ones where the cost has been skyrocketing are
yeah,
things like healthcare, education, the things where you see deflationary forces, so they're getting cheaper and better, are the things that government doesn't touch at all. So that's one of the things I'll note about these things is like anything where the cost is going up and to the right tend to be heavily regulated, subsidized, complicated economic business model,
right.
where you have different payers for different things, and then the things that are getting cheaper, better, faster, lighter are the types of things, that private companies are able to compete against each other and improve performance on. So, it's again touching on, it's like the what, which is there's stagnation in different sectors of the society, but then there's the why, my inclinations are like, oh, let's look at the regulations, or what's different about the time eras, and maybe if we look at the institutions how they used to be, maybe we can make some progress, but maybe that's debatable. I don't know, but interesting.
Definitely. Is it something like, I've got this thought that maybe, so we had these New Deal, this entire government infrastructure was built during the New Deal, and all the smartest people went to Washington, and they founded these new institutions, and it's just been this long run trend where it's just entropic and it's getting worse and worse and worse. And in 1971, maybe most of the original people are completely gone, and it just, I don't know, this general degradation.
I think I think that's right. There's something, was it Ronald Reagan who said like the government is always the enemy, or did never call the government? I forget.
Yeah.
He has some phrase, and I think that's the typical sort of libertarian reflex. But what I think is probably more true with a little more nuance is that every institution, whether it's a private company or a nonprofit or a government body, they tend to have a life cycle. And when things start out, there's a little more energy, there's more degrees of freedom for creativity, but over time, the people within those institutions harden, the rules get set in place, the vested interests, their hold on the power cements, and therefore by the end, it's not nearly as productive as it used to be. And I think that's true of government programs. So if you look at NASA, I think is a good one where, the excitement of the space race drew a lot of the great minds of the era, from engineers to pilots and so on to work on that. But by the mid 70s, when the Cold War fight over space was over, the bureaucratic sclerosis had set in. And NASA started to, maybe their budget was tightened some, but it was also the case that, now these people who were established higher up in the hierarchy, originally they had been hired for competence, but now they're just there because they're in power, and you get all these, things are done because it pleases the chain of command rather than because it's good, or all these sorts of problems that creep into bureaucracies. So that happens in government programs. And so if I bet if we started something today and dumped a bunch of money into it, maybe it'd be pretty good and competent for the first 10 years, but then that corruption would sort of bake in. And then that life cycle from birth to flowering to old age, I think it happens faster in government bodies, and then they become zombies that just live forever.
You can't get rid of them.
Whereas private companies, it happens, and then they go out of business because someone else replaces them. So I think that lingering zombie period is problematic.
Definitely. You wrote something recently, and I thought this is perfect, and I'm just going to repeat it. It's the pandemic
Sure.
blew through our Maginot Line and has exposed the feeble state of our science. We don't have testing at scale. The FDA, the CDC, and the WHO are bureaucratic, feckless, and unreliable, and we lack the treatments and vaccines. And you go on. I think this is a perfect summation of what has happened. It was clear. It was clear to me, at least, that things weren't working very well, but
Mm.
there's no illusion anymore. There's a recent 60 Minutes segment where they had brought in a plane load of cruise ship passengers. They're all elderly. They all had COVID. They're all like falling over. They had COVID, and
Wow.
they're about to die. And this was early on in the pandemic. And the CDC let them walk into the Atlanta airport, which is the largest airport in the
Oh,
U.S.,
wow.
and just walk straight. And, all these elderly people are like, "Man, I don't think this is a good
Yeah.
idea." This nurse is like, "Wow, maybe we should be doing this," but they let us through, and they're the experts. What's to be done? I mean, like the level of incompetence, a lot of people complain about Trump's response, but I mean, it's
Yeah.
every level of the government just
Right.
completely failed.
God, you go back to the news stories in January and February last year, where you could pull up 50 to 100 news stories from different, outlets, prestigious, not prestigious, where the headline is, "Don't worry, it's the flu," or "Don't
That's
worry,
right. It's all fine.
wear a mask, don't wear a mask." You had government officials lying directly to us.
Yes.
It was so absurd. And so, therefore, I think we've lost a lot of trust in these institutions, which is sad, and it's tied to that level of competence. Um, for me, I've been in some debates even with my mom on this, because there are some miraculous things that we should be grateful for, but I'm so uh, I'm grateful, but on the other hand, I still feel frustrated. So, take for example Moderna.
Yeah.
And the miraculous thing is that the lead researcher on the vaccine received by email the genomic sequence of the virus. And then, based on that, within 3 days, he had devised the vaccine. That's incredible. He
Yeah.
didn't
It's
even have a
awesome.
copy. He didn't even have the virus present. He just had the information about the
It's
virus.
amazing.
And based on that, he was able to devise a vaccine. And then, Trump, I think, to his credit, worked with the FDA to loosen up the rules. Operation Warp Speed poured a ton of money into this. And then, if not Operation Warp Speed, even the promise that the government would buy billions of dollars worth was certainly incentive enough. And so it took about a year, even 10 months, 11 months, and then those vaccines are out. So I want to acknowledge that, okay, that's pretty good, especially relative to the past, where
Right.
you might look at other vaccines and it took sometimes 7 to 10 years to bring them to market. But I still get frustrated, because I go back to the guy getting the blueprint for the vaccine in 3 days, and take the FDA and the rest of academia and any authority. The gold standard in testing now is the double-blind, randomized, controlled trial. This is where you take two groups. Some people don't know they're receiving the treatment. Other people receive the treatment. You pay attention to them over some period of time. You're looking for efficacy. You're looking for safety. And these things take time. And that's the gold standard for figuring
Right.
out whether or not a therapeutic works, or a vaccine. But an alternative that other people have, many people, economists, and even people in healthcare have thought about, is something called the human challenge trial. And what that is you directly expose someone to the harm after receiving the treatment. So in the case of COVID-19, it would be, day 4 after this guy invents Moderna,
Yeah.
someone takes the vaccine, and then, they deliberately expose that person to COVID-19. And we'd know pretty quickly if it worked for that person, right?
Exactly.
And if it worked, then you try it on the next person. And then, you could get volunteers. People could, consenting adults could say, okay, we don't know how dangerous this vaccine is, but you know what, I'm willing to try it out. And so we could have been getting results as early as last February and March. And based on those initial results, you can expand from there. I like to compare it to, it's like if you were testing a parachute give it to someone and then let them walk around the city and do whatever they do. And then, if they happen to jump out of an airplane, then we know if it works.
Right.
It's like, no, you have to test that.
Push them out the plane.
Yeah, there's only it's it's got to be tested in those conditions.
Right.
And because humans, I think adults have the power to consent to do these things. I give the benefit of the doubt for those people to make those decisions for themselves. We could have obtained that information even faster. So, as miraculous as it is that it took a year, I think it would have been fascinating to see how much faster it could have been with those human challenge trials. It looks like England is starting to experiment with the human challenge trials, so that'll be an interesting thing to pay attention to. But yeah, so that's just another example. And then the responses. As good as and the development of the vaccines were by private companies funded by the government in this one-time push. But anything that was just solely the government was horrendous. Yeah, the CDC, well, the WHO, the international body. I don't know if you ever saw that video way back of the official. He would not acknowledge that Taiwan was a country, so he was clearly in the pocket of the Chinese member.
Oh yes, I remember that. That's great. Which country are you saying that's doing so good with COVID? I've never heard of them. I don't think they exist.
Yeah,
no, that exists.
The CDC, the FDA was off on the testing. In the beginning, the testing was so bad because the FDA required that only one test could be used. People weren't free to devise their own. So yeah, the response could have just been, we could have adapted much more rapidly had not these bureaucratic institutions slowed us down. And it's sad because it costs lives.
Definitely. It seems, yeah, it's something, it makes me really mad at the end of the day, but so potential paths forward. One solution I've thought about, and I don't know if you have any, in North Carolina, this is actually accidental how this happened, but in my hometown, it's about 90 miles east of the Capitol. And, they wanted new jobs. And so the state senator goes up, he lobbies, and he moves the DMV from Raleigh to Rocky Mount.
Okay.
And, essentially, most of the bureaucrats quit, and you can actually refound the institution. And
wow.
So we've got app based. You can update your driver's license and do all this stuff. It's all app.
No way.
Right? It's pretty awesome. Is that a feasible approach? Do you have any ideas how to improve these massive bureaucracies that are just don't work anymore?
Well, that touches on a good way to do it, which is you need to start over sometimes.
Yeah.
There's an old economist, Mancur Olson, who his specialty was collective action problems, political economy. He wrote a book called The Rise and Decline of Nations. And what he looked at was how war had decimated Japan and Germany, World War II, to the point where they had to start over. And so when after the dust had settled and the US had decided to keep the peace, the German economy and the Japanese economy just did phenomenally well. They grew like weeds from 1950 to call it 1970. And so the question was what Mancur Olson looked into. He was wondering why was that the case? And his theory was something like you described with the DMV, which was that all the accumulating vested interests who had blocked innovation or anything new entry after the war, they were all gone. And so, in effect, they got to reboot. And some of these new companies and institutions, they have a energy and life force to them at the beginning that, as I said, fades with time. And so, his theory was that that's what accelerated their growth. And then the life cycle continued to the point where you started to get the sclerosis, and that set in. So, yeah, what do you do? Well, if you think of government like an industry similar to any other, you can say, okay, well, what drives innovation in any industry? And there are two main elements, possibly three, but the two would be you need new entry, meaning someone can try to offer the same service for a different way or cheaper, better, and then you need experimentation. So, I mean, maybe experimentation comes first. You experiment, you try it, and then the new firm launches a new product. But without that, you're not going to see many improvements because it's going to have to depend on people within the organization making complaints and then making adjustments. And it's just, think about how hard it would have been for Sergey Brin and Larry Page to persuade the people at Microsoft to adopt their search engine, right? I mean, it's like they were hired as entry level engineers, and they had this wonderful idea at night. And now they've got to pitch it to their boss, who pitches it to his boss, who pitches it to that guy's boss, and finally gets to Gates, and Gates is like, I don't know, that might drive some change, but it's just really hard. Whereas if you can leave, exit, and start your own thing, experiment, try it out, that drives innovation forward. And so when it comes to government, it's hard. Some things just require a monopoly based on the provision of that public good. It could be, law enforcement. It makes it hard to have new entries. So how do you try to find competitive pressures to improve these services? It's hard to say. I would, the DMV is a good example. Where is that something that could be privatized? I wonder.
Right.
So
does that look like charter cities, seasteading?
Well, yeah. So to bring it to the widest scale,
right?
I think the fact there's this frontier thesis in history that in order to try new forms of government, you need new entry and you need experimentation. But in the past, there were places you could do that. You could go west. You could go west, young man, and try something out. And the Mormons did, and the gold miners did, and so on down the line. But nowadays, all the land is gone. I think if we do, I think we need to find a way to experiment and try new things. Charter cities, to me, represents a great way to do it. So you can't, it's like the complaining to your boss who has to complain to his boss. Making change that way is very difficult. So if you could find a plot of land to set up your new rules and institutions, then you get to try them out, and it would be opt-in. So you're not taking anything away from the old system. Some people who like being in that system can stay there. You're not trying to coerce them. And then the people who want to come, they're doing so based on their consent. So in a sense, it's almost more democratic to me than just voting in elections, because if democracy is based on the consent of the governed, then what is the richest form of consent but immigration into some region? It's like America is a nation of immigrants, and by people coming here, that they're willfully consenting to the Constitution in a much richer way than like me just being born here. I never looked at the Constitution and said, oh yeah, this is a contract I want to sign. And so I think we can't. One of the great movements in political philosophy could be to abandon this idea of the social contract, which goes back to Locke and Hobbes, which was always a hypothetical thought experiment. What would people agree to if they lived in the state of nature and they wanted to form some bonds of cooperation, right? Well, this is not a hypothetical social contract. It would be a real one. And people would enter a charter city. And the point for me, the great thing about that wouldn't necessarily be any particular charter city's rule set or constitution. It would be the fact that they're competing now with the old systems, and therefore they'd have to improve in order to get people to stay. You'd start to see some competitive forces at work, and maybe that would improve the quality of the services in both nations, or both city states, in a way that we don't see now. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of charter city idea. There are some other ideas in Patri Friedman, old friend of mine, I think he coined this phrase, just competitive governance, and seasteading is something that he was pursuing for a time. That's the wild idea that, okay, we have no more land to try these new ideas out. So can we find a way to try them out at sea? That seemed wild and controversial in a way, that I don't really understand, because then we have Elon Musk saying, "Hey, let's go to Mars and essentially do the same thing."
Right.
So why is the sea, people are like, "Oh, the sea is weird, but the moon, Mars is amazing." But that would be great too if we could get, if we get to Mars, and then eventually develop it to some extent, and in the wildest science fiction dreams terraform it, then that would be a new frontier,
Definitely get to
and
do a
people
kind of
could
a
try new
refounding.
things, and by doing so, I think they would be able to improve our institutions here.
Definitely. Do you think there's a trade-off between having like a hegemon and having a bunch of smaller competing states in terms of just like aggregate violence? Like maybe it's or is it just something like, well, we've had this kind of peace for a while because we burned so hot in World War I and World War II, and that's
Right.
why things have been. Do you think there's a trade-off there? It used to be like in Europe, they'd have these small wars all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm not quite sure how to answer it, other than to say my reflex is to say multiple competing nations, city states, and so on is better, even if there are small skirmishes and
Got it.
battles, than the risk of global catastrophe, or a totalitarian one state order.
Right. That makes sense.
It's fascinating to me that the New Testament touches on this.
Oh yeah, really?
Yeah, so I
Interesting.
am by no means a biblical scholar, but I am a fan of Dostoevsky. And in the Brothers Karamazov, in the famous chapter about the Grand Inquisitor, there's this discussion about the time Jesus spent in the wild, in the wilderness. Sometimes it's described as the desert. In my King James Bible, it's the wilderness. And so Jesus is tempted 3 times by the devil. Um, Essentially, the devil's like, "Hey, you're God, or you're part of God and powerful. Why don't you just do these 3 things and make it easy for man?" And one of them, the most famous temptation, is turn this stone into bread, because the world is full of suffering and hunger. How can you stand by and watch these people suffer and die of famine when you could turn this stone into bread? And that's a wonderful challenge to any religion, right?
Yep.
And the famous response is, "Man does not live by bread alone," right? So it's interesting. That's the first temptation. I forget which order they're in, whether it's the second or third, but one of them is related to this question, which is that the devil, Satan, says, "Why don't you unite all the world in one peaceful government?"
Right.
And Jesus declined. He said, and I forget his exact words, but it's something like, "That won't work."
Right.
So it's interesting to me that, in essence, the project of Satan is to establish one world government, and
We should draw strong
the
lessons
true
here.
Christian response is to be wary of that. I don't know, fascinating to ponder, but there is something to be said in the historical record where you look at large nations. I think China, I forget the name of the dynasty, but they were at their technological peak probably around 1500. They had they had the printing, they could print on paper, gunpowder. They had these large ocean going vessels that could travel from China to Africa. And then I forget which emperor died, and something happened, and the next guy was just a Luddite and banned all new technology and the use of these things. And because the country was so large and the rules so expansive, those prohibitions just flattened out everything, and progress died in Asia. Whereas by contrast, in Europe, all these multiple competing kingdoms at war with each other, if something was invented in Italy, and then banned, but there was some use to it. Maybe the King of France sponsors that person to come. This happened with Da Vinci, for example. That guy was like this mercenary who was hired by different kings to do different things. But that drove progress for a long time. So I think there is something to be said for these multiple competing jurisdictions and kingdoms and nations that helps drive progress through some kind of competitive nature.
I think that
I,
makes us
I,
a
I don't
little
know. It's a great question though. Is like, the one worlders. If you're
right.
like, for example, what's his name? Robert Wright. Robert Wright.
Yes.
Book he wrote called Non-Zero, which is this take on history about how the past is zero sum, the future is positive sum, and that was the lesson learned over time. He makes an argument in a chapter for one world government, and his arguments are probably familiar. It's something like, hey, with a pandemic, or with threat of nuclear war, or environmental catastrophe, global warming, it seems to be the case that just as in tribes and in cities and nations, we figured out ways of cooperating with each other to solve these problems. It seems as though now we're at the precipice of global cooperation. And so we should just accept a one world order. But I'm afraid my reflexes are to say that's so dangerous. Maybe it's good for 10 years, but eventually the some of those forces that we described earlier, the sclerosis, the bureaucracy, that's one part of it. But then there's the worst part, which would be totalitarian domination.
Right. There's no exit. There's nowhere to
Yeah.
exit to.
And that could prove that's almost an existential threat, I think, on par with volcanic eruptions and asteroid hits.
Right, exactly. Yeah, there's a great Bertrand Russell essay where he talks about the future, and he's like, "Well, by 2000, we've got like three options. It's like we're going to be extinct. It's going to be one world governance, or like we're all going to be at war all the time." I was
Yeah.
just like, that just doesn't intuitively make sense to me it's stable to have this one huge world
Oh
government.
yeah, right. That the three nations were at war, or pretend war, or war. I
Yeah,
can't
it's like
remember the plot. I should reread that. But
it's interesting.
yeah, and I think there's something on the separate from just like science and tech. I think it's even tied to the arts and literature, and you need a Galapagos like effect where you're isolated enough that you're able to experiment and try out different things, but not so cut off that you're not aware of some improvements in other places.
Right.
So you look at the the discovery and development of quantum mechanics. I think is interesting because it was like all these different European guys, and yet they all had a different flavor and style to their thought. So like Fermi, as an Italian, was a different type of thinker from von Neumann, who was
Right.
from Hungary, right? And then that's interesting to me is even in the hardest sciences, you get a little bit of different style and flavor and approach based on having been grown up in a different place.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a good reason for our differences, and maybe nations are a good way to preserve that.
It does seem like things have shifted though. Like since you're talking about these physicists having these different outlooks, things have seemed to have gotten much more universalized across countries. So I remember going to London a couple years ago, and like, man, this is what it has much more in common with the metropools here. Like even in Durham, North Carolina, has a lot more in
Yeah,
common with London than with like my hometown. Like there's a
yeah,
farther cultural divide. Even in Shanghai, I felt this. Like I don't know, it's
it's
very
a great
bizarre.
observation. I thought that, yeah, I have friends in London or Paris who feel closer to me in terms of just the novels you read, the movies you see
Right.
and quote, the sorts of concerns in your life about career, the organizations you work for, and so on. It's just so similar, so much so that, yeah, it feels like when you meet someone who lives in rural America somewhere, it's almost like a different country.
It's very bizarre. Another quote here. I think this
Yeah.
is a good point. So, surveying our system of higher education as an antagonist, I've come to see that even though there are some 5,000 universities and colleges in the U.S., there is only one point of view on every campus. And as a single standard for right and wrong gushes out like an oil spill with every graduating class, the careers of the elite, McKinsey or Goldman Sachs, and their
Yeah.
expensive playgrounds, San Francisco or New York, have swelled with risk-loathing conformists. I I really enjoyed this. I wrote this very short essay
Yeah.
for my university, and they edited out McKinsey and like changed it to something like very because they were afraid that the recruiters would go away and wouldn't come because I was mad that all our talented people were going to work in management consulting and finance and not building things. Um, What do you think about this? Like, what's to be done? Like, how do you inspire people to drop out and pursue and actually build something?
Yeah, I don't know the causes of that issue. Is it the case that because all these industries were banned, that people can no longer work in them, so therefore they're not exciting? So think about nuclear engineering as a career
Right.
path. Hopefully that changes, but the last 20, 30 years, it's been slow going just because it's so hard to build nuclear plants. Um, it's a challenge. So it could be the case that these things were just banned outright and people couldn't take those jobs. So
It's
the
not
only jobs
possible.
they took were in the paper-based world of finance and management consulting. But on the other hand, I think people are risk averse, and they very much are imitative. And so because these great fortunes in their eyes were made, maybe not so great, it could just be like $1 million, which sounds I mean, that's a lot of money, but it's enough. If you're 20, 21, you might be impressionable, and therefore you take that career path. And it's just so visible. So Wall Street's just so visible, and it's gained so much importance in the last 30 years that it's drawing people in. I don't know. I don't know what to do about it. Because outside of like, hey, maybe there are these industries like nuclear power, where if
Right.
we loosen up the regulatory constraints and we get building again, that could be exciting. But otherwise, it's just like the money's too good, the entry points are too clear. They have, like you just mentioned, it's like the Goldman Sachs and McKinsey have the money to pay career services to host the job fair. There's an application process that resembles college. It's competitive.
Great
And
legend.
then from the student's point of view, or the new hire, these jobs seem to maintain optionality for people. They get to keep alive the sense that life is full of possibilities in the future. I'm not quite sure what it's going to be, but don't worry, down the road, then I'll start my company, then I'll write my novel, or
Right.
then I'll sing my song. I don't know what, but people like preserving that feeling that they'll have the option to do it later, and those careers seem to provide that for people in their 20s. Maybe it's just to go on the business school or law school.
Right.
Um, and because of that, what I think, though, the trick is that they think they're going to get the optionality, but as they get into their 20s, now they're making $200,000 a year or more. They've got a spouse, they've got a pet, they've got a house with a mortgage, and then it just becomes too hard to take any risks at all, because you've got all these other commitments that you have to give priority to, and by that time your 20s are over, you're into the 30s. So that's something that's really pernicious. And outside of trying to show that there are other rewarding and fulfilling careers, I don't know what to do about it. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them.
It's really interesting. I heard through like an acquaintance, like a friend of a friend, that one of the things you guys would talk about at the Fifth Deal Fellowship was like they bring somebody in and just beat them with, you have to learn how to be happy on like 50K a year,
Yeah.
like just so like you can maintain that flexibility to actually go out and build something. Because if you get the golden handcuffs, you're attached to
Right.
the 220K a year or whatever in the BMW, you could
I
never
mean, maybe
escape.
that would be a piece of advice to people. So like, even if you make 150K, put away 75K, don't even look at it as your personal,
Exactly.
and that'll be your personal runway. If you add it up after a couple of years, you'll be, that's like your own angel round.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. And you can kind of escape. Um, Yeah, it's a really crazy problem, and it's difficult to even comprehend what to do about it.
Yeah.
Another quote, I really like this: "To save the West, we must return to its roots. There's more to the West than Rome. We must return to London, Athens, and Jerusalem." What do you mean by "there's more to the West than Rome"? And what are these? And what must we return to?
Yeah. I became interested in the West as a concept, just because I started to, I mean, for one thing, it's always in politics, especially coming from conservatives, like, oh, we're losing our sense of the West. And I had taken a vacation to Paris. I think I was standing in line to get into the Louvre, and it occurred to me that a lot of the architecture in France, in particular, is very Roman in its gestures and style. In Napoleon, when you look at, and I saw some paintings inside the Louvre of Napoleon, and he very much adopted the Roman emperor vibe. um,
Definitely.
so I was like, wow, what is this? Why is it so much Roman influence? And then thinking about what Rome meant as empire, as securing peace within a territory over a long period of time in a long, geographic dimensions. I thought, well, you know what? That's just one part of the story of the West. The West is comprised of different things that make it great, and so that's why I started to use these ideas of cities to think about it differently. And it just felt like, yeah, whenever people talked about the West, it felt more like this Roman concept of maintaining a perimeter on an empire and securing peace within. But I think other things are important, like the arts, or science and technology, or just the average living standards of a man on the street. So so I started to dig into that, and what I thought was interesting is, yeah, what makes the West great? So London, if you compared to the law in the rest of Europe, the civil code, the common law is just more conducive to business and making agreements, contract, torts, property. The common law just handles these things in a way that are better for everyone's well-being than even the civil code of France, and which is tied to Roman law. It goes back that far. And so the common law, and you can do institutional comparative analysis of former colonial possessions, and the ones that were under British rule are faring better than the ones that were under French or Spanish rule. North and South America is another example. And so, as an operating system at the foundational level of society, the common law is just very powerful. And it is the root of our classical liberalism of adults making agreements with each other, exchanging goods and services. So I thought we shouldn't lose we shouldn't lose that ideal in the form of a symbol. And to me, that felt like London. Athens, Rome versus, Athens. Ancient Greece is not ancient Rome. These are two different places. And Greece was very innovative, and it was in part driven by some of the forces we've described. They were not a nation in our sense of the term. They were a loose confederation of competing city-states. And that competition started to drive these engines of progress in the arts, drama. So in ancient Greece, we saw the development of tragedy and comedy. We saw the first strong development of philosophy. It went from these bizarre the sayings of Heraclitus that I love, right, very enigmatic, to these discourses on politics and justice and the good, the true, and the beautiful. And you saw the development of mathematics, astronomy, and so Greece, just phenomenal advances in science. Our ideas that theory is a Greek word, this idea that the truth is independent of the human mind, and that what are the attributes of this truth? It is true for you. It is true for me. It's universal. It is true for all time. If we discover something about the universe today, and it's true model of how it works, then that will be true here. It'll be true in Alpha Centauri, and it'll be true in a billion years. And so that sort of understanding of knowledge comes out of Greece, and we shouldn't forget that, which is not Roman. And then the last thing, which is interesting to like my upbringing, because I studied the classics. It's like my Bible is Homer, and I've got Homeric poetry tattooed on me. So, but, nice. All of which to say is like my emphasis tends to be that way. So I'm not as knowledgeable about the Judeo-Christian influence in the West, but it's powerful. And one of the things that I think comes out in those stories is a different notion of the truth that is different from the Greek idea of truth that is universal, true for all time, absolute. And with the truths of Revelation, you look at people from Abraham all the way up to Jesus. There are people who had a private truth that was true for them in some very profound and deep way, that only they believed in, that their conscience adhered to, and then they went against the crowd in some fashion, because that was true for them. And with the story of Jesus's life, it's like time is different as well. So the Greeks' view of time was cyclical, this never-ending cycle, but with the advent of Christianity, suddenly you have a definite point of time. And going back to Judaism, you have a covenant with God, that, is a compact that holds between a specific group of people in a specific time and place. So that sort of tension. Leo Strauss is he famously talked about, he characterized these as cities. So he characterized this as like Jerusalem versus Athens, this tension here. But the truth of the West is that a lot of the creativity we have as a civilization is from the energy generated by these two polarities, and I'm characterizing it as like four. So it's not that any one of them is true, and oftentimes there's tension and conflict between them, but it's that tension, I think, that can drive creativity and progress. So I wrote an essay about that. And it was interesting because, I was surprised people actually read it. But and I still go back every so often, because whenever you hear a politician talk about the West, it immediately comes to mind Roman Empire and now American Empire, and what they don't refer to are some of these other things that are very important.
It's definitely come to dominate. So that's a great segue. Are you up for a round of overrated and underrated?
Let's do it.
Okay, cool. So just give me a sentence, overrated, underrated, maybe a sentence of why. So Strauss, overrated or underrated? You just mentioned him.
I think he's overrated nowadays.
Gotcha.
My one sentence take on that is the whole idea of esoteric writing is kind of fascinating, because suddenly you get to look at these old texts and say, well, maybe there are secrets within here. Plato wasn't, when Plato really banished the poets, did he really mean that, or was he saying something else? It adds a new dimension to interpretation that I think can be valuable. But taken to its extreme, suddenly now we have the careerist mandarins who are afraid to say anything in public, and so everything has to be read between the lines. Forthright. So in that sense, maybe Strauss is overrated. I also don't. It's like not enough people love to talk about the esoteric writing. But what did Strauss really argue for when it comes to the a just political regime? I don't know if he has clear enough answers on that. I'm not a scholar. I've only read some Strauss, but it's like what is the vision of the future that Strauss had? I'd love to learn more about that, but it's not discussed. So that's why I say overrated.
Got it. That's well put. Tom Wolfe, overrated or underrated?
Way underrated.
He wrote some good stuff. He wrote some really good stuff.
I think and by way underrated, I mean as seen through the eyes of New York publishers and editors and academics and even other writers of his era. He was just enormous. He was just wild. He was just so funny. His style was innovative at the time. Now every teenager texts the way Tom Wolfe writes, all exclamation points. But if you go back to when he started out, the dominant influence and voice in American literature was Hemingway in terms of style.
Right.
And in Hemingway himself was very innovative in that he developed this really crisp, lucid, clear style that you recognize immediately and can be parodied, right? It's like, we were walking on the green grass and it was cold and wet and Pablo was with us. It's like, so coming from that, suddenly Wolfe went in the other direction and you get these ornate, sentences with exclamation points and ellipses and dashes, and I think he was reacting to what he was coming from. So, to me, so he's a stylistic innovator. He was a innovator of genre. He really developed the nonfiction, literary nonfiction, fiction, books, nonfiction books that read like novels.
Right.
And then when he switched to writing novels with The Bonfire of the Vanities, that's probably the last great American novel.
Yeah.
And by that I mean it's a novel that touches on the issues of the day. It was something that everyone widely discussed. Not just academics or not just some effete literary group. Right. It was like all of America was discussing his novel, and it really touched people. And made them laugh, or made them think about things differently. And so, to me, it's I think only because he was conservative. I don't know who he voted for. He seemed to lean Republican at times, but I think because of that, he was never really praised by his peers. And so, to me, it's quite sad that he never won the Nobel Prize. If you look at a book like the Right Stuff, I think this is one of the great works of American literature.
It's really a bummer.
Yeah, it's crazy. So, all right, that's my wolf spiel.
No, I love that. I love that. He was an inspiration to you too, isn't that right?
Yeah. God, you're so naive when you're 18, 19. I opened up the back page of The Bonfire of the Vanities, and there's that little picture of the author and a paragraph bio, and the fact that it said he had a PhD in American Studies from Yale. I'd laughed my ass off through that book, and it's such a wicked satire. I thought to myself, oh, if I want to write like Tom Wolfe, I need a PhD.
It's ready to go. From Yale in English literature.
Yeah. So influence on that way practically, but also just I love his foresight. He's almost just too prescient. And so we're still living in the Bonfire of the Vanities. Whenever you see these celebrity trials or scandal trials, and the press acting one way and crazy politicians doing something else, you have to shake your head and say, holy shit, we're in a Tom Wolfe novel.
That's great. I love that. Von Neumann, overrated, underrated?
Ooh, I think he's underrated because not everyone knows who he is. But among physicists and mathematicians, people in those circles, von Neumann, I think, is rightly regarded as one of the greats. But to me, it's sad that most of America doesn't know who he is. He was just this extraordinary polymath, made major contributions, and invented whole new fields like game theory. Also, impressively practical in his later years, from helping out with the trigger on the atomic bomb to inventing the computer architecture that we use today. So he was I believe he was the second hire at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is the pinnacle of geekdom. That's awesome. It was their first hire was Einstein. And von Neumann was a member for many years, and you get to the Second World War, and all of a sudden he has this idea. He says, "I'm not thinking about bombs. I'm thinking about computers." And he had crossed paths with the people working on ENIAC at Penn, and so he had a different architecture in mind. He wanted to build, and he applied for money and space to do it with Oppenheimer, because he was the head of the institute at the time. And it was this huge controversy because it was supposed to be this Olympus of theory where no one moved a thing. And now you have von Neumann wanting to build a garage so he can make some newfangled thing called a computer. They gave him the money and they did it, but it was such a racket that they had to move out. I don't know. It's just this great story about practice versus theory to me. But yeah, so I think he's way underrated, just a fascinating mind. And then the other thing that he's a part of that I wish more people knew about was he and a small group of people from, pretty much the same neighborhood in Budapest.
Yeah, what was in the water in Budapest in 19?
Yeah, I don't know, but this small group of people made incredible advances in science. in a short amount of time, just these very impressive contributions. People like Edward Teller eventually on the hydrogen bomb. I'm going to mix up names, but Leo Szilard, who's another physicist who conceived of a way to split the atom. They were all known collectively as the Martians because they had these thick Hungarian accents.
That's awesome.
And yeah, people like von Neumann could multiply something like 7-digit numbers in his head in half a second. And so people thought, no, the only way these people, the Martians are here, and they're actually from Hungary. So I'd love to know what was in the water in that time. How did these people learn? How did they come to think how to think? Because they were just so creative in a short period of time. And maybe there's some lessons we can learn from that we haven't really drawn yet, because no one's really done a good study of that.
Definitely worth checking into. So one more.
Yep.
The Present Age by Kierkegaard. Overrated, underrated?
Underrated. It's got to be I should have no time to think. You just got to
just spit it out.
I think that book is underrated because it's short, it's crisp, it's much clearer than Kierkegaard's other writing. So it's a great entryway into his way of thinking, and it's underrated because it hits on some of these themes we've been talking about. Kierkegaard, I believe on his gravestone, it says something like, "Here lies an individual," and the emphasis is on individual, because in the present age, he talks about this leveling phenomenon. Leveling to him meant, eliminating all the differences between ourselves so that we were all the same. And he was so sensitive to that issue in such a painful way at times. But I think we're all rewarded by what he went through in order to pursue his life as an individual. I'd also recommend the book Fear and Trembling, which is a just astonishing, wonderful book about the Abraham story. And
cool.
and it goes back to Plato as well. So in the famous Euthyphro dialogue, the question at hand is something good because God loves it, or does God love it because it's good? And Kierkegaard takes his crack at it in that book, and very much comes down on the side of it's good because God commands it.
Nice.
That's not a view you're going to hear today too often.
Nope.
But it ties to, I think that's related to being an individual, because it goes back to that idea that in your conscience, maybe you have some calling, something you can't explain, an intuitive awareness that, and it's unintelligible to others. You can't give reasons to explain it, why you're doing it. But because you have some inner faith about what you're doing, you pursue it. And that, I think, is something we should all try to inculcate to some degree in ourselves.
Well put. Michael, where can people find you, and do you have any parting thoughts?
You can find me at William Blake on Twitter, at William_Blake. I was a tech journalist, as I mentioned, and I guess this was 2006 or 7, and Twitter had just formed. And maybe a month later, we were covering it. And so I signed up to the service, and I thought, what is this, like something for haikus? So my username was that of a poet. I love William Blake. Definitely check out his book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. But yeah, so that's my Twitter handle. It's not because I'm a weird pseudonym. I've just kept it. You can find me at my fund's website. We have a form anyone can fill out if you're interested in pursuing ideas that might make for good companies. We work with a lot of makers, hackers, and builders. So if you're looking to, find like-minded people to work on things, definitely reach out over our contact form. And then I'm just out and about in the world and at large. So, check me out. Sometimes I write stories for City Journal, National Review. So, maybe you'll see me there.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael.
Okay. Thanks for having me so much. I really enjoyed it.
Take care.